Humanity Matters.
Welcome back here to HMTV. I'm your host, Rich Acritelli, here on the Fog of War and Humanity. For our second segment, I'm here with my special guest, Renee Pardo, to speak about her experiences, learn about the Holocaust that greatly impacted her family and her family's time and her time here in America. Renee, we were talking about your family. Can you shed more light on your father and some
Sure.
of his experiences?
So Victor Pardo, no middle name, born in 1929. By the time he experienced the worst of the Holocaust, I'm going to say he was 18, 19 years old or so, or actually even before that. I think I mentioned before, my Aunt Sarah, who was living in Salonica with so many Jews, considered a big city, had warned the family of what was happening. She then returned to Salonica. But she had told my father's family, her parents, her siblings, listen, they're going to come. And when they come, be careful. Don't believe them. She went back to Salonica. And sure enough, I know the story of Florina and the story of the surrounding villages that had Jews in them, Sephardic Jews. That's exactly what happened. So my father's family, for the most part, scattered to the mountains, which were right there, right? They were hiding. They were pretending to be something they weren't. What I know from my father's story and from my dad to some extent, and a lot from my mother, is that my father at one point was separated and he was with one of his brothers. And there were, again, so many siblings, but he was with one of his brothers. And at some point, I think something happened and they were found in the woods, separated from their family. My father believed he was going to be shot and killed right on sight, because that's what would happen when the Germans would encounter these like bands or groups of people that were hiding.
Yeah, they see them as guerrillas or runaways or escapees
Jews, right?
Jews.
Or somehow, but again, it's
and
hard,
that happened
right?
to your family already, so.
Right, and you don't know, and the Germans didn't always know: are they facing Greeks, or are they facing the other people that are in that country? And now people like my father are learning languages from who they're around. So the story that I know is that my father and his brother dropped to their knees and quickly did the sign of the cross, right? Because they knew that's what Catholics did, or
Sure.
to pretend they were not Jews. Any identification as Victor Pardo, Germans didn't understand Pardo and Sephardic Jews when they came in. So name didn't sound like the Jews that they knew.
It was not a common name.
Not
right?
an Eastern European name. Very common. Pardo, Besso, Salty, names that have Russo, names that sound Italian or Spanish were Sephardic Jews, but the Germans coming in there didn't know this whole history. They were learning it in big places like Rhodes and Salonica, because they would come in and everyone was Jewish, so they had sitting ducks. But in the woods, in the mountains, in places like this, they didn't know. They didn't know unless somebody told them. So doing that, they were spared. They were not shot. And exactly like you said, didn't mean they were loved, but they maybe guerrillas. My father was taken with his brother to what was known as a work camp. So it wasn't a death camp in the sense of let's kill Jews here.
It was still a prison, though.
Yes, and he was there for some time. I have only been told, depending on who you talk to, what happens, because my father only talked about being there, but not about how he got out. My understanding was that my father, it became very physical. My father survived and was able to get away, and then was in hiding. Again, with my uncle, and trying to find his family. And I don't know all of what happened in this time. And I know at some point, my father was identified as a Jew, and so was his brother. And the reason was that somebody saw him. And the way I do remember my father telling me this when we were in Greece together, that it was a priest of some sort that identified him, like a Greek Orthodox priest.
Did you go back to that area?
Yeah.
Where he was at?
We did.
Wow.
I did. And only with my dad. It was hard for that. You know, my parents didn't have a lot of money, but I bothered my dad so much about going to Israel because I had friends in Houston that were, you know, much more, their families were more well off than mine. They were educated lawyers, doctors, executives of Texaco. My father was a shoe repairman. And I wanted to go with my friends to, you know, a year that it was before birthright was a thing. This was 85, 86. And they used to go anyway as a synagogue trip or as a group B'nai B'rith trip. I wanted to be part of that, but it was a luxury trip where you stayed in hotels and you went on. My parents couldn't afford that.
Yeah, Long Islanders do that here. So.
They do that here, right? But that's now luckily paid for by birthright, right? But at the time, that wasn't available to me. But I told my dad when my friends were going to Israel, and my dad arranged, and there's stories about this too, but how he was able to arrange, he made a trip to Greece because he actually had still a couple of friends there, not Jewish friends, and to go from Greece, when we were in Greece, we were going to buy a ticket and he would take me to Israel. And he said, we'll even meet up with your friends, but you'll see it with me. So we did get to go. And my mom didn't get to go. My sister, who was 7 years older, it was me and my dad. Part of this trip, by the way, was absolutely horrible. Being alone with my father at 16, just my father being certain the way he was. Part of it was very eye-opening for me. But it's also now, when I look back, part's very special. And I got to walk through Florida with my father. We would see people, sometimes very old people, and he would embrace them, Greeks living there, not Jews.
Yeah.
And I thought, how wonderful. Then they would walk away and he would say, shame, that one gave away a Jew for that. Like, he was two-faced in front of them because that was his survival. And he did not have any affinity or love because he saw it as a complete betrayal of his entire family.
And it came back to him too, right? He was in his hometown and years came off of him and he remembered.
Yeah.
So.
It was something else. But at the time, being 17 or 16, so it was right before 86, seeing that, I didn't completely understand it. It was more of like, there's my angry dad again. That's my angry, upset dad. You know, here I am thinking he's loving someone and hugging them because I don't understand Greek. Like, I'm listening. I didn't know it. But I see a loving conversation.
Yeah, you get confused, right?
And I thought, and then he would tell me something terrible about them. We don't care about them. We don't love them. He had a friend that he was very happy to see. The guy's name was Yanis Irawanis, and I will never forget this. So we stayed at Yanis Irawanis' house, and there was a whole story about Yanis. Apparently, Yanis had a very wealthy family, but his parents had said that if he wasn't married by a certain time period, all of their family's money was supposed to go to the church. And the story was that the church came and said bad things to this man's fiance, and so he was a bitter old guy. By old, he was probably our age, right? And so Yanis lived by himself in this house. And I think that the way I was able to do this whole trip is that Yanis financed it. He was trying to get some of his money out. And my father got a trip for us to go to Greece and then Israel because he was going to help Yanis. Wow. I don't even know all of this. Like, this was happening in front of me. And then even more funny is that, and maybe it isn't funny, maybe it's sad, I don't know. One of the ways when we were in Greece, at one point we ended up walking by the butcher shop, and the butcher invited us in. We sat in the back. Again, they don't speak English and I don't speak Greek. And they're talking and talking, and it's raised and not in a bad way, but it's intense. The whole time the butcher is cutting up and doing his work, the blood, like I'm 16 and I'm a Texan, and I'm like, why can't I be normal and just be with my friends in a nice hotel? Why do I have to do that? My mother is lucky. It's hot. It was the summer. I'm like, my life is a joke. I'm 16 and annoyed. I want to listen to my Michael Jackson album on my headphones and Peter Gabriel, and I'm stuck here with my dad. I didn't realize when we went out, my dad told me, he just threatened me. They're afraid that I'm here, that I want the property back. He said, if we ever come here again, he's going to get all the other butchers. And I don't know that he actually said that, but my father said that he said that. And based on the tenor of the conversation, that could have been it.
It wasn't positive in many.
No,
any
I mean,
means,
if I was today, I'd have a phone and I'd record it and I'd know what the hell happened, right? But that memory was so shocking to me because I lived through it and didn't know that. And my dad said, screw him, basically to me. He's like, I don't care. You watch what I'm going to do. My father needed to get us to Israel, right, for the next part of the trip. And to buy the ticket to Israel there, you would go to Athens and you have to take an El Al flight at this time. And if you know, even back then, certainly always, you have to go into like a bunker to get to El Al. Like you're in Greece, you go through an alleyway, you have to go through an elevator, you have to go through security just to get to do that. So he needed money. My understanding is while we were in Greece, my father purchased a bunch of cattle without even really us doing anything. I do recall that we saw a whole lot area full of animals, and my father did some business, and then my father sold them before we left.
He was able to make a profit?
And he made a profit.
Wow, good for him.
But do you understand that I now know also more details, and I had to learn this later from my mother. He had them all drink a ton of water and salt water so that they would weigh more. He had no qualms about cheating whoever he was cheating. They owed it to him.
Yeah, sure.
And it's so funny. Again, I make that example.
Especially in Greece where
he didn't care.
He didn't care. You know, he had some fond memories, but most of it was negative.
No, when my father was given a Greek cookie or Greek food, I could see the look in his eyes, how much he loved it, how much he wanted that. But there was that hurt too.
Yeah.
But it also explained a lot about, you know, again, I wanted to have the parents that were, you do the right thing, you tell the truth, you're honest.
Was betrayed at a very early age.
But his betrayal really tainted his entire being.
And it stayed with him.
Forever. And that's how I was raised.
So now, what years was he in Auschwitz? When does he end up there?
So I don't know. I know that it was towards the end. And I also know that I believe, again, I think when my father was first taken, he was in the catch-all of them not knowing for sure if he was Jewish. I do know that he was able to find out that my Aunt Sarah was still alive, which was shocking. But she was kept in a separate place, so like sightings of her were a big deal. And that's what I had heard stories about.
It was a huge complex there. It was
huge because it was enormous. I don't know anything specifically about his time there or how exactly how it happened. I do know that depending on who you speak to in my family, they have a different version or rendition, and it may be because he said something different. And that's the hard part for me, that I don't know that. I know the things that he told me when I was in Greece, a lot of the things I learned for the first time as a 16 or 17-year-old. But I do know, for instance, I know that this picture that I have here, I'm showing it to the camera, I blew it up. So this was a really tiny, almost like passport photo. I love even seeing the shirt he's wearing. It's like the only clothes he had, and then over it, a jacket. And my understanding from my mother is that this picture was taken, love that cleft in his chin, Victor Pardo, good looking guy, right? He was only about 20 here or so. I know that this was taken when he had been starving, had had nothing to eat. This is supposedly the end of the war when they had liberated and made them go on some march for a long time. And he didn't know if any of his family was alive other than those Sarah sightings, and that he had to get back to Greece.
How many family members survived?
So I don't even know exactly. I do know that my grandparents survived, and I know that most of the siblings survived. I know that there are some that did not.
Were they sent to Auschwitz or other camps as well?
Other camps as well. So remember that there were camps, and it doesn't always get listed in the literature, but there were Greek concentration camps.
Yeah, sure, all over.
Yeah, and they oftentimes had other people in them as well, but they were. So I don't know that. I do know that it was a miracle that Sarah survived. I know that my Aunt Salonica survived. I know, and again, these are people that eventually made it to Brooklyn. Part of the family, when they finally returned to Greece, those that could come back to Greece, it was clear they were not getting their lives back. And again, now you have a Greek civil war. My uncle that I mentioned before, I know served in the Greek army at that point. That's my father's younger brother. And I mentioned Louise. Louise was his wife. Dadio, or David, was his name.
And was he in prison during the war as well? Or was he?
I don't know his complete story, but I do know that. For instance, his older brother, who was right here, and my uncle Albert, another older brother. There was Albert and Menahem. Albert's wife, there was another area of Greece called Kassoria. These probably were not that far from each other, but
Sure.
The Florina people considered themselves one community, because even my Aunt Salonica later would say, you all are Florinese, we're Kassor, like that was better. I'm like, it's all 100-mile radius, if that.
It's like here with states.
Correct, right?
Right.
They all had numbers. They had been in Auschwitz. So I know that from the numbers. But my father's story was always different. There was talk about, that he had survived and that, he had eaten part of his number off in order to remain. And I don't know everything about what was true and what was one of my father's really stories in the sense of part of his survival. What I do know for sure is that when they went back to Greece and tried to resume a life, and basically were being told, and now there's communication from even the United States, that this is where you want to come to the United States. You will never have a life there. They will never give you anything. And they're not recognizing you as a group like they are the Eastern European. The Red Cross isn't going to give you help. They didn't understand or know. And now there's so much less of these communities. No support except for the Sephardics that had already made it here. So there is a society called the Monastir Society. That's a burial society. There's several that are made up of these areas in Greece or in Turkey. Those people who had come here and had already been here and were very successful in the garment industry. One such example is a man by the name of Russo. And in Cedarhurst, you see his name and that name everywhere in the Sephardic temple. They helped bring over lots of Sephardics, lots of the Florina Jews, lots of these Jews.
Is that a community here on Long Island, Cedarhurst?
There's a big part of it that's still there. At this time, it was Brooklyn.
Okay.
They would give people jobs in the garment district, that sort of thing.
Any spots out here on the island that has that type of community?
Well, yes. I mean, for instance, it's sad, but again, if you go to the cemetery in Beth Moses, where my parents are, right, there is a section that is taken care of by this group. Okay. And where that group is made up of is a lot of people on Long Island or Brooklyn or in this area, and people who live in Florida, and they all keep this together. Part of the I guess, community for a long time was also in Brooklyn. That synagogue recently closed, but the Cedarhurst synagogue kind of usurps their people, and their anniversaries of their deaths, their names are kept. So that's all part of that too. But to get back to what you were asking, like as far as their stories and all of that, it became about where are you going to live, where you're going to be able to be free and not have this happen to you again. And my father really wanted to come to the United States, but there was not a clear path for him.
Now how does he finally make it over here?
So I have a picture. It's big, and I didn't bring it, but I could find it in my phone for you, of them all assembling. Again, now we're talking 5-6 years after the war, at the train station in Florina. They cannot stay there, and they're leaving. Several of much of the family went to Israel and settled there. I have relatives in Israel that are the brothers that went there. And then the aunts, including Sarah, came to the United States when they could. For her, because she had been, there was actual, for Sarah, there was an actual written documentation of her story. She was able to get here. But for my father, he could not come. He didn't have a sponsor. He couldn't come. But there was family that was also making it or settling in Brazil. So my father, and Chile. So my father went to South America. And this part, you would think at this point he just wanted to live a normal life. He's now, he's in his 20s. He has nothing at all. And his family is not all together. They are all trying to make it here to the United States or to Israel. My dad did not want to go to Israel. And at the time, it's Palestine. He did not want to go to another place where there would be war and his life would be hard. And who could blame him?
Yeah, it was total instability. Right?
Total instability. No, thank you. I don't want to fight for anybody. And the joke always in my family was my father was his accent saying, I want to go to America to marry a blonde woman. That's the joke. My mother, by the way, was blonde. Same history, not from Greece, but from Monastir or Turkey, born in the United States. But the Castilian Spaniards were blonde, right? So that was the joke. But my father made it to Brazil. And while he was in Brazil, and this part I do know, he was approached by men that were part of an illegal organization called the Iliabet, which was the precursor to what is now the Mossad.
Yeah, one of the top intelligence gathering and security forces in the entire world.
And the first time I heard this, I really thought, is this another story? Is this true? But what's so interesting is that, especially if you read the book, I think it was like Catching Mengele, about Mengele's story and how the Mossad did this in the beginning. They reached out to people and they found people who they could help outside of Palestine, outside of Israel, to ask them, especially if they look like my dad. You did not know they were Jewish. They were no longer sick from the war, but they felt the same way. And they really indoctrinated him to the sense that you don't even have to want to live here. This is going to happen again, and it's going to happen forever unless Israel exists. And my father believed that to his core. And I think it's because of his time there. And my father was given a choice. He had no job. We'll give you money. You will survive. And if you still want to go to the United States, we will help you get there. But you have to work for us for 1.5 years, 2 years.
Now, do you have this picture of your father?
So my father agreed. And they also told him, you're not going to want to go though. So we're going to talk to you in 1.5 years, 2 years. You're not going to want to go because this is your country. This is going to be Israel. You're not going to want to leave. And he believed them and he said, I will, but I will do it. So my father ended up going to Israel. Here's a picture of him. And I can't tell you exactly where this was. I know that this is at a kibbutz. And he spent some time at kibbutz Masada and another kibbutz in Israel. When I got to go to Israel with the trip paid for by the cows drinking salt water, he took me to these places and he didn't recognize them. He told me, kibbutzes used to be nothing, and they were working to make the land. And he never wanted this hard land.
It was very early.
Right. When I went in the 80s, these kibbutzes were gorgeous resort-like areas with swimming pools, right? And my father was blown away by this.
And he was up near the Golan Heights?
At some point, I also have this here. I have lots of documentation and different passports because my father, a lot of his material was not real. It was put together so that he could go and help buy arms for Israel. My mother told me the story, and I never heard this from my father, that at some point my father was in a submarine. I'm like, how? My father didn't even know how to swim. And her response was, if you had to swim when you were in a submarine, you were in trouble. But the job was that he was going to go and he was going to help the forces so that they had enough guns, if they had enough ammunition, because they couldn't get it from anywhere else. And my dad did that. And I don't remember, there's a Hebrew word, and I should have looked this up lately. There's a Hebrew word for the Mossad that went and got people to do this, regular people, without all of that training. And they would use them and pay them for the work and help them get where they needed to be.
I could be wrong, but I think the British, right? They were on their way out.
Correct.
And this was before Truman recognizes in 1948 the state of Israel. So there was some major difficulties with getting people and weapons and resources in there.
It was all illegal and it was all underground and and again, my father, as much as he then said to me and always, Israel has to exist. It's so important. He didn't want to live there.
The vice president of the Holocaust Museum here, Bernie Fershpan, his dad fought in the same wars as your dad helped out with.
Yes.
And it was one rifle that 3 men had to share.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was...
Yes, that was it. There was so little material. And my father did what he considered his part, but they kept their word. And my father was able to come to New York. And he finally was here in shortly before 1959. He married my mother in 1959. That's when he met her in Brooklyn.
Your dad laid the groundwork for one of the strongest militaries in the world. It's this tiny place, not a lot of people. The Israelis can fight, though.
So when I was telling you about that I wanted to go on that trip in the 80s, when I finally got to Israel with my dad, I think my dad and I were sick of each other. He was tired of me being whiny and upset with him that I didn't have anything. And I had an extra problem. When we flew from Texas to New York, you had to go to New York, then go to Greece, where we were going. My suitcase got lost. I ended up getting it later. So I went as a teenage girl who had packed for this trip with nothing, right? And I had this father who didn't want to spend money, and he had to buy me things. And I didn't even know what things cost because I didn't know what the conversion was. So he was figuring it out.
It's a little bit of a struggle.
We were just annoyed with each other, right? When we get to Israel, I was so happy to meet up with my friends that were there, staying at these nice hotels. But when they were getting the tour, they would get a Palestinian tour guide, they would get an Israeli tour guide. I got to meet up with them. I don't think this could ever happen today, and just sort of be an extra on their trip because the leaders knew me, but they knew I couldn't go on that trip. And I would see that, and they would say, this is where this war happened, and the 6-Day War started here. When I walked around with my father, and who knows what was accurate and what wasn't with my father, but I believe that mostly he told me the truth. My father was like, I was standing here. They were over there. Like, I got it from my dad about this happened here and that happened here. And I met my family that had never come to the United States. I met my family that had, instead of, my father eventually came to Brooklyn and married my mom, but these siblings went and married other Jews from that region and area. They looked different. They were different.
You might have
was great.
You might have said this, but what year did your dad make it over here?
50. It was my parents got married in 59. So I believe he got here at about 58.
Wow.
Because it didn't take long. He met my mother. He did not speak English.
What was his first job here? Do you remember?
Oh my gosh, I do.
Or he had a bunch of them?
Nope, he did. The very first thing that most of them had to do with a sponsor was the stuff sponsored by the garment district. And it's funny because I heard stories about my father that make total sense. So he had to be a presser. So in other words, you would get paid per piece. You had to press, and they wanted you to do it in a certain way, like go down the arms of the garment, then you go down the middle, and then you do the back. So my father figured out that if he did a garment a different way, he could get through more and get paid more. And he was fired from his first job because they said, you're getting paid too much. You need to do it the way we tell you. And my father couldn't stand for that, got fired. Shortly after he tried that in the garment district, I know that he became a butcher. He had that in his family, so he had some experience in doing that, and he learned to be a kosher butcher. And so he worked as a butcher for, I think, many, many years. And then even when we went to Texas, even though my dad had a pizza store, while he was figuring out what he next wanted to do, he needed a job. And he worked as a butcher for local supermarkets there. Yeah. So that was always something that he could do.
Was he proud to be in this country? Was he, pleased to be here and have his family here? And
beyond belief, but in the sense of, I don't want to give the wrong impression that he was a flag-waving American. He believed that this was the country to be in. He believed that he wanted his family to be raised here because this was an easier way of life than Israel, where he had fought in those wars and felt like it was always going to be peril, and he didn't want that for his family. So very much so. But he was not somebody that wanted anybody to know his business. So because of that, it wasn't a situation where he was like, now we're going to celebrate, we're going to talk about this. He really felt that even though he was happy and proud of his family,
he was private.
He wanted to be private because it was his belief that it could happen again.
Now,
and that was the what really kind of took the whole tenor of his life, was it could happen again, and how could we avoid it?
Before we go, was there one thing that he loved about America in terms of assimilation? Like he made pizzas out in East Hampton. Was that one of those things where he had a business?
Absolutely. I think what my father loved the most was that you could do anything in this country. And he really appreciated that. He was a terrible employee. That's why it never worked out for him. He didn't want to listen to anybody else. And the fact that he could have his own business and that for him, it was reasonable taxes. It wasn't the situation of the communists coming in or that you're not allowed to own this. And he loved that. We differed in opinion because I felt, well, that's because you're American and that'll never happen here. And my father's belief was it absolutely could happen here. It's never going to happen as long as Israel exists. So we have to support Israel. But I don't want you to have to live there because it's just too hard and they're always going to try to kill. Yeah. And he was done with that. He was done with that. From the time you're 10 years old, you watch your family members be killed, murdered, or have to live and suffer this way. You don't want that for your family.
And he had to make a deal in order to come
get
here.
here.
So
yeah.
But all right, Ms. Pardo here. Thank you very much for coming here on HMTV.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. This was some story in your family, and thank you very much for your time.